Hi everyone. You're supposed to be watching this lecture on Friday, February 26th. If you're not, well, that means that you're probably behind and you need to correct that. Okay, so I am going to start sharing my screen so I can pick up where I left on Wednesday. And briefly, just a quick summary. We talk about theoretical approaches to the role of the government, and we talk about Friedman and Hayek espousing the neoliberal policies of free markets as the best of all possible worlds. The idea of not interfering with market activity, either with taxes or regulation or subsidies, all of those things interfere with the market mechanism, which is like the compass that points in the right direction. So they said we need to limit the size of the state, minimize all these type of interventions so that we allow the government to perform its functions. And if we do that, it's going to be the best work for all because it's the maximum efficiency that we can achieve. And they said, we don't need the government to make decisions for the people. People are smart enough to make their own best individual economic choices. So, and this is the basic tenet of neoclassical economics. And then we said, okay, it's not that simple, guys. We have, I mentioned these heavyweights, Nobel Prize in Economics, Ronald Coase, Oliver North, Williamson, that basically said, it's not that simple because markets are not perfect. They are really good. They are wonderful machines, but sometimes they fail and they produce significant cost and significant damage to the society, right? So they speak about transaction cost and, especially how this impacts this market failure. The idea that we really need to have the institutional framework in place before we can think of market efficiency. And this institutional framework includes formal rules like laws and regulations, but also informal type of rules or constraints and norms of behavior, self-imposed codes of conduct, like, don't litter on the street, things like that, that are very useful to discipline activity, to, in a way, self-police ourselves, and also to guarantee that the, proper regulations and laws are going to provide the support for market activity. So let me explain this just with one example. Imagine that there was not a system by which we could buy or sell houses, like the place where you go to get your title of property, or the banks to borrow the money, or the people that go and inspect the house and make sure is in compliance with construction codes. All of these things seem simple, but this is the type of institutional arrangement example that gives you some idea that without this, the most efficient market wouldn't be as efficient, because, well, people will cheat, the houses will fall, the people will probably lose their houses if they don't have a title of property. I think you get the idea. And then we talk about the third group, which basically claims, well, yes, markets can be efficient even if we have this institutional framework in place. However, that's not enough, guys. That's not enough. We need state intervention because sometimes we have incomplete or missing markets, or as efficient as markets may work, they don't produce equitable results. They increase income inequality, wealth inequality. Sometimes, they concentrate poverty. Sometimes they produce externalities, especially negative externalities like pollution and crime. which we want to minimize. And sometimes they produce positive externalities like educational health that markets are not going to promote enough. So the markets must be supported and helped by the role of the state intervention in this type of settings. And of course, they talk about carefully crafting the role of the government to particular conditions. So this is not a cookie cutter approach. This is not, okay, 50% government, 50% market. That doesn't work in every case. You need to tailor this calibration in terms of how much the government should intervene to the particular characteristics of the country, the region that you're talking about, right? Anyway, so I also said that all of this was happening, remember, we're talking about the 80s, in the context of very significant changes in the international arena. So I already mentioned the election of Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, in Europe, in England, because they both marked a significant shift from heavy government intervention to market-driven economics, right? This supply-side economics. But that was not the only important event, internationally speaking, that shaped what happened in Latin America. Remember, in the late 1980s, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as well. The Soviet Union being dissolved also meant, for many people, at least in the minds of some people, the defeat of the socialist regimes and the communist type of policies. And of course, many people saw this, okay, now it's a no-brainer. We just need to keep going the way we have. Minimal government intervention, heavy market activity, free market activity, liberalization, deregulation, all of these things that, again, were imposed, espoused and imposed in Latin America by the World Bank and the IMF, right? So, all right. So what we are going to see next is, okay, what happened in Latin America? And what is happening still in Latin America? Because this is not over, right? This is something that happened 30 years ago, or began 30 years ago, but has not been completed. So in Latin America, we are going to see that redefining this role of the state has included many elements, but we are going to talk about fiscal austerity, tax reform, and privatization. I am going to concentrate on these three important elements to try to explain what happened in Latin America. All right. So two important institutions, multilateral agencies, play an important role, at least initially. The first one is ECLAC. Remember, the Economic Commission for Latin America. They spoke about this fiscal covenant, which basically said, okay, we claim that the state must play a significant role. But what does that mean? All right. So they said, yes, all right, we need to take care of the fiscal budget, the fiscal deficit. We cannot run a deficit forever because we obviously, we cannot generate debt, either internally or externally, because eventually the funds are going to run out. So they start talking about privatization. The idea that all of these state-owned enterprises should be sold to private hands so that they would be ran more efficiently, not so much with a social goal in mind, but the private goal in mind would be enough to guarantee the efficient working of all these industries. Of course, they talk about keeping some industries in the hands of the state because of, safety reasons, this key sectors like electricity, communications, especially, in the case of Mexico or Venezuela, oil was kept in the hands of the government, and other important sectors that were not sold. Second, they also realized that, we should be able to increase the productivity of public management, to eliminate these bureaucracies, to eliminate these, duplication or triplication of duties that was just overlapping, creating inefficiency. So they said, all right, we need to work on that. We also need to have a more transparent fiscal activity to increase the legitimacy of what the government is doing. So we need to clean up this, because many people have really good reason to believe that, all of these taxes and all of these monies that were going to the state were not going to they were not finding their way back in terms of public goods and public services. So, tax revenue, or all these monies raised by the government, which were not many, and I'm going to explain this in a second. Some of them were devoted to what they were supposed to, but a large chunk was kept in the hands of corrupt officers. Of course, promotion of social equity, reducing inequality and poverty, and of course, the improvement, the development of democratic institutions. So this was the ECLAC approach, which again was influential because, remember, ECLAC is a UN-sponsored multilateral agency that has significant weight in terms of policy making, in the case of Latin America through ECLAC, but there are other similar sister institutions in other regions like Asia or Africa. ECLAC just happens to be the one in Latin America. The second institution that played a significant role was the World Bank itself, because the World Bank, remember, was originally created to rebuild Europe after the war, the 1940s, the 50s, the 60s, but suddenly in the 1980s, okay, what do we do with this World Bank? Well, they should be shifting from rebuilding Europe and reconstructing after the war to promote economic development, right? So actually the official bank of the World Bank, the official name, of the World Bank, I forgot the proper name, but has reconstruction. You can look this up online. But anyway, obviously, they are not reconstructing anything anymore. They are in the process of promoting economic development, particularly with through the financing of large infrastructure projects like dams and hydroelectrics and highways and hospitals and airports. They specialize in big infrastructure projects. Anyway, they start talking about, okay, guys, we understand that the state can play a role in economic development. So recognizing the institutional approach that we discussed before, they talk about the establishment of the rule of law, property rights, defining who belongs to whom and why. They also talk about, policies that were not distortionary, for macroeconomic stability that would, generate confidence, predictability, and that would generate, more investment, and that would generate growth. The idea was to stabilize the dramatic previous 10 years during the last decade in Latin America. We need to keep things under control, invite people to come, because now, things are not going crazy. Now there is somebody in charge that presumably knows what they are doing, right? And a few other things, they realized that protecting the environment was important, protecting the vulnerable was important, but here is the key element. Even the World Bank recognized that we should be thinking as the government, the state, and the market as complementary, not as enemies, that they were, going after each other. We should figure out ways for them to collaborate, to participate as a team in this quest for economic development. So the idea was, okay, what we need to do, World Bank economists, is that we just need to figure out, to identify the areas where the state should do less because markets can do a better job, and the areas where the government should do more because the government could be doing a better job than markets, right? And again, we are going to talk about this later, but essentially, once again, remember the rationale for government, the ones that I discussed at the very beginning, the rationale that had to do with public goods, public services, infrastructure, externalities, the representation of future generations, and dealing with poverty and inequality were the main areas identified for the government, to allow the government to have a bigger role, and let many other areas to markets, free markets. They can do a much better job, except these few here, right? Anyway, so the World Bank was a very important element in this whole discussion, because obviously, well, the World Bank and the IMF were channeling money to Latin America to rescue them from this financial fragility and instability that they were subject to. All right, so let's start talking about one of the major challenges in Latin America then and even today, right? So this is, I hope this is going to open your eyes in terms of what's happening in Latin America, at least, partially, because, it's impossible to give you the whole picture in just a few minutes, but here is the story. Right now, and this has been true for the last, 30 years or so, the public sector in Latin America, the size of the government in Latin America is approximately half the size of the typical rich economy in the world. It's like, and you will be thinking, no, that's not possible, Professor. No way, no. Yeah, well, okay, a few exceptions like, Cuba or Venezuela right now, right? But the point that in average, the size of the government relative to the size of the economy is much bigger in the US, Canada, France, Spain than what it is in Mexico, Brazil, or Argentina. And the reason for this has to do with taxation. Latin America has a big problem when it comes to raising taxes. So if you think that filling your 1040 form every April in the US is a nightmare, you have no idea about how complex the fiscal system and the the equivalent of the IRS in Latin American countries is. It's just incredibly complex. And because of that complexity and that bureaucracy, there is a huge amount of tax evasion when it comes to income taxes. Income taxes, I'm talking about personal income taxes and also corporate income taxes, right? When the government is unable to generate tax revenue, obviously its financial position is incredibly weak because they don't have the ability to spend in what they are supposed to be spending. Public goods, public services, infrastructure, education, health, all of these things, they don't have enough money. They don't have enough money. So this is what we call in Latin America the tax problem. So let me explain why. What's happening here? Well, if you remember, during the ISI strategy, this protective bubble was mainly tariffs. And remember, a tariff is just a tax on goods that are coming in from the rest of the world into Latin America. So for decades, the vast majority of the tax revenue was coming from tariffs, right? And of course, they are easy to capture because if you don't pay your tax, if you bought a bike or a pound of cheese or whatever, you just don't get it, right? So you pay the tax or else, right? So it was a very easy way to tax people that way. And also it was a very good source of corruption because very few people had control over this. And this is what actually, in part, fueled the reluctance to dismantle the protection, because the companies that were asked to start competing with the rest of the world didn't want to do that because they were not ready. But the politicians in charge of making decisions, they didn't want to dismantle protection either because the tariffs provided a significant amount of wealth for them, some of them personal wealth. So, in East Asia, they understood this problem, and maybe because of cultural elements, maybe because of policies, maybe because of a series of elements, they said, we need to dismantle this. You're ready to compete. I explained what happened in East Asia, but not in Latin America. Then, when the debt crisis begins in the 1980s, and the IMF and the World Bank start saying you need to dissolve, you need to eliminate all these protections, guess what? Suddenly the largest source of tax revenue for the federal and local governments is gone. Is gone because liberalizing international trade basically means reducing tariffs, well, in some cases to zero, right? So the tax revenue was gone. And then you also need to remember that during the import substitution industrialization, we saw this massive migration from the countryside to the cities, because the countryside, agriculture was completely abandoned. The idea was to industrialize, and all of this investment was taking place in the city, in the urban areas. So you saw a large amount of people moving, searching, seeking jobs and opportunities, right? So now, overnight, or in the matter of a couple of years, the protection is gone. And now you have the following problem. How is the government going to finance all these government expenses? Well, they realized that income tax was not going to work because many people, as I already explained, we are going to expand this later, began the process of what now is a huge amount of people working in the informal sector, the underground economy. People, I can take you to any major city in Latin America, similar to any other developing country, Cairo in Egypt, or in Thailand, or the Philippines. And it's pretty much the same thing. But in Latin America, I'm talking about street vendors, street performers. You can buy food, clothes, tools, or services, shoe shining services, cut hair, haircuts, all sorts of services and goods provided in the underground economy by millions of people. I mean, I'm talking about in some places, the underground economy represents 30% of the size of the total economy. So there is a huge leakage of, personal income tax and corporate income tax, because these informal economies in Latin America operate totally outside of the formal system. They don't have, a number, a tax code number. They don't follow the health code. I mean, they operate totally outside the law. So the only possibility to raise tax revenue has been the value added tax. Or in other words, you can think of this as the sales tax, because you cannot evade that. Even people in the informal sector, when they buy, especially from the formal sector, they have to pay a tax. And you don't pay a tax to, when you buy a taco or when you buy something on the street in Mexico, but somebody needs to buy the resources, the corn, the gas for the stove, and eventually, you know, the tax is transferred to you in the form of the price. The point is, the value-added tax, the sales tax is very regressive. What does that mean? All right. Most countries in the world have what we call a progressive tax system, which basically means the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. If you make less money, you pay less taxes. You make more money, you pay more taxes. This is what we call a progressive tax system. The sales tax or the value-added tax is the opposite, is what we call a regressive tax system, because think about this. If you make $1 million in income, or you make $40,000 a year in income, you pay the same, say 8% when you buy a pair of shoes. You get the idea? So 8% of, say, $100, which is the value of your, you know, sneakers or whatever, $8 for a person that makes $1 million a year compared to a person that makes only $40,000 a year is not the same. Relatively speaking, the person making $40,000 a year is paying more than what a person making $1 million is. So this produces what we call a regressive tax system. And this is not necessarily good because, you know, some studies have demonstrated that this can increase and perpetuate the disparities between the rich and the poor. Huh, right? Anyway, the idea right now in Latin America is to figure out how to fix this, how to, I'm calling this to combat the tax evasion, how to increase revenue from direct taxes and green taxes. The idea is to figure out a way to reduce the reliance on the sales tax because of its, it's regressive, but also because you miss a lot of people, and, increase the amount of tax revenue so that the government gets stronger and they can provide the goods and services that the population requires. We know one idea that has worked in some cases partially is to figure out a way to move business in the informal sector to the formal sector. That's what we call the formalization process. But unfortunately, when you do the calculations and the business cost of compliance, not just the taxes, but to be in compliance with the health codes, with the labor codes, with all the different regulations, many people in the informal sector say, if I move to the formal sector, I'm going to be out of business. I don't want to go. And they don't. And they just don't, right? But anyway, the point is that the fiscal problem in Latin America is a big, big issue that is still huge because the informal sector, as I said, in many countries can be as large as 30, 35, maybe even 40% in some cases. So, we can come back to this. Fisher in 1990, he said, one of the big issues with the failure of the ISI was not that the state was too big or too corrupt or too bureaucrat. It was really the fiscal inadequacy, relying so much on tariffs only obviously produce a problem because, it's the equivalent of, like I said before, putting all your eggs in one basket. You don't want to do that. You want to diversify your sources of income so that if one or two fail, you have one or two that can cover the whole. In the case of the ISI strategy, that was not part of the equation. And when the liberalization took over, suddenly the most important, perhaps in some countries, the only source of tax revenue evaporated, was gone. All right. Now, here is another problem in Latin America, the huge corruption problem. And again, this is not unique to Latin America, but it's more visible in Latin America. And we can talk about different types of corruption even in rich nations like the US. We can talk about the, lobbying, for example. Sometimes people have defined lobbying as a form of institutionalized corruption. But anyway, let's not go there now. Corruption is a problem because when you have a corrupt government, it contributes to the low credibility of the government itself and the institutions supporting the government, right? So when you have corruption, you have weak public administration, weak capacity for law enforcement, and a whole different, set of problems. Just to give you an idea, in 2001, and you can go to this website, transparency.org, which is a very interesting international organization that collects information about perception of corruption. And I need to clarify that, because they basically, you can read the methodology on this website to see how they measure this. But anyway, in 2000, just a few years after all of these policies were implemented by the IMF and the World Bank, at the very bottom of the rankings, we're talking about 145 countries, you had a huge amount of Latin American countries: Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, obviously at the very top you have Canada, the US. Chile has always been an exception, has been, ranked very highly. The police officers are very well respected. The military are well respected. We can discuss the reasons for that later. But the point is that corruption adds to the cost of development because it's a cost. Let me explain this. We don't see this very often in the US, but those of you that have traveled, that have family, or perhaps that are coming from different countries, developing countries, understand this. The idea of bribing, the idea of, putting money under the table, secret donation, things like that to make sure things move your way and the way of the recipient, of course, of the bribing. This is also a form of a regressive tax because it's not the same for a person to pay a bribe of $100 or 100 Mexican pesos when they are making 20,000 pesos than for a rich guy that pays the same $100, but they make, 500,000 Mexican pesos. So corruption is also a very regressive tax. However, interestingly, some people have argued that although corruption has very negative elements in terms of politics and economics and ethics, in a way you can think of corruption as the oil of the system. Think about this. When you have an engine, metal against metal, sparks fly, right? So you need something like oil to make sure that they work properly. Well, Cesar Gaviria, the former president of the Organization of American States, one time in public basically said, just like I told you, yes, it hinders trade, growth, development, creates disincentives to invest and some other problems, but makes the process work. With no bribing, things don't move. With no corruptions, things would stop. I'm not sure I buy that argument. I'm not sure I agree with that statement, but it is true. It is true that I'm sure you can give me examples of, situations, not personal situations, but situations that you have seen, you have read, that where without this oil in the system, this corrupt behavior by certain people, things perhaps wouldn't work as smooth as as they could. Mm-hmm. And the other problem with corruption is that has been identified in Latin America is that especially people in positions of power, public servants, public officers at the local, state, and federal government, sometimes they are not paid well. Sometimes they receive low wages. So since they have this power, this capacity to make decisions, to move things forward, they see this corrupt behavior as a way to supplement their income, right? So in the minds of some people, this is actually not such a bad thing because, okay, I am not getting paid enough for my family to live, decently. So if this guy comes and offers me a bribe, I'll take it. All I need to do is to sign, move the paperwork, and move on. Everybody wins. That's in some cases the mentality, right? So this is a problem. Second problem, right? You have the taxation problem, you have the corruption problem, ongoing in Latin America right now. All right, let me explain something else that happened in Latin America. I'm not keeping track of the time. I have no idea how much time I have passed, but I think I have time to cover this part. Okay, so this was another huge situation that happened in Latin America. One of the conditions for the IMF and the World Bank, if you remember, was to privatize state-owned enterprises. They should be in the hands of private people that had the entrepreneurial capacity and experience to, run these companies domestically and internationally. So rather than operating at a loss under the hands of the government, they should be making a profit. Rather than being inefficient in the hands of public officers, they should be efficient in the hands of private hands, in the hands of private, entrepreneurs. And this was very attractive in the 1980s, especially for the presidents and officers that were in charge during those years, because guess what? Think about selling hundreds, thousands of industries to private investors. This was a huge opportunity to create revenue for the state, but also for themselves, right? Unfortunately. So there were three types of privatization schemes. You can see them here. The sales of assets, basically, they issued stock of the corporation and they sold it, through the stock markets. Not every Latin American country right now has a stock market, but most of them do. Obviously not as active as, the New York Exchange or Chicago, but certainly in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they have very highly functioning stock markets. Here is an interesting one. The concession for the provision of public goods through an auction. And this was an interesting one because I already mentioned his name, Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest men on earth, a Mexican person. Obviously there is no record of this, but I think most people would agree that most of his wealth came from the purchase of the largest telecommunications company in Mexico that later took over pretty much all Latin America. Because guess what? These entrepreneurs like Carlos Slim were very smart when they bought. He was rich already, but he became super rich later. They were so smart because they said, okay, I am going to bid for this, the concessions were, part of a bidding process. So there was a sealed envelope. Nobody knew the amount until the officers opened the envelopes and whatever. So it was supposed to be a very confidential type of process, which obviously helped, to pick the winners and all that. But the point is, Carlos Slim, like many other people in other countries, said, all right, I'm going to buy this. I'm going to bid for this. But if I win, I am going to need protection. Like, what, protection from whom? From international competition. So you are going to give me access. I am going to buy a state-owned enterprise like a phone company that has been protected for many, many, many years. And suddenly you want me to compete, it's going to take me years to rebuild, to reorganize the company, to understand the competition, to all of it. So give me years of protection. And guess what? They got it. Carlos Slim got protection for 10 years, after it became private. And that's how he built a fortune. And many other people, I can give you names in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Argentina, very, very well identified families benefited from this privatization process. Mm-hmm. Of course, this opens up the questions like, what is better, a private monopoly or a public monopoly? There is some studies that have been produced out there in the literature that demonstrate that privatization actually worse, make income distribution and wealth distribution worse, because obviously very few families were able to acquire this massive amount of industries that, had the potential to create a huge amount of wealth, and some others. But, just to give you an idea, here on this box, or this table rather, you have the revenues that we're talking about, for each country. We're talking about millions of US dollars. So, let's pick one year, the largest one. In 1998, Latin America sold $33,897 million in state-owned enterprises to private hands to Latin American people. Mm-hmm. So this was a huge amount of revenue. The problem was that it was a one-shot adventure. Tax revenue is a recurrent source of revenue. Personal and corporate income tax happens every year. Sales tax, every time there is a sale. But privatization, you can only sell the company once. So this huge amount of money was generated once. And this was 20 years ago. 20 years ago. But even today, many people wonder, what happened to all of this money? Where is it? Right? The ideal answer would be, okay, it was used for a massive infrastructure program in Mexico or Nicaragua, or, something that you could see the fruits of the money. And in some cases, I have to be fair, and, not all of the money was stolen, not all of the money was lost. I mean, there are many examples of things like roads and airports that were built with all of these resources, programs that were launched during this with these resources. But many people really question the consequences, the welfare consequences of privatizing all these state-owned enterprises, particularly because, think about this, it was not just about moving from state ownership to private ownership. The idea was to make this more efficient. So many people lost their job in the process. Unions were unable to do anything to defend the public sector employees because they had no option. The company was going to be sold to private entities, right? So there were significant job losses, and that magnify the already bad income and wealth distribution in Latin America. This was a very, very interesting period in Latin America, because many people saw this as, okay, well, we are going to generate all these millions and millions of dollars that are going to, help, and in some cases did partially, but obviously that was not enough. That was not enough. I think I'm going to stop here and continue with the last section next class. Let me stop sharing. All right. Again, I'll always forget the time. Maybe we've been like 40 minutes or so. But anyway, I'm going to stop now. It's Friday. Even if it's short, that's okay. Again, if you have questions or comments, let me know over email. Stop during office hours. Don't forget to read, watch the videos, and, well, be engaged, guys. Be engaged. Thank you. Bye.